to Best of the Best 2012. My name is Katie.
I'm Jessica.
And we are librarians at the Brown County Central Library. Today's books that we talk about can be found on our website at www.browncountylibrary.org. The list is on our website. You can also access our catalog where you can place holds on the books as well. Let's get started. America is Under Attack. It's part of the Actual Time series. We've had some of these on our list in the past. I know the one It Began Here was the Revolutionary War book. There's one on the Gold Rush as well as one on the Titanic. This one focuses on September 11th. And it's a straightforward telling of the events of the day. This is for older grade school and would be a good introductory book if you want to talk about it, particularly because we are reaching a time now where some of our grade schoolers really were not of an age and some were not even born when this took place. It is a straightforward introduction. It doesn't sensationalize anything. It tells what happened in New York on that day. It goes to the Pentagon and also mentions Pennsylvania. And we go throughout the day talking about what happened first. We go through steps that after the crash, the pandemonium that happens and the confusion that happens in the towers. We have some pictures here talking about a flame that came into the lobby of the building, and we see people scrambling. Yet it's done in cartoon style, so it isn't particularly graphic, and the language is very straightforward. And we talk about the heroes of that day. They discuss different firemen and some of the things they did during the day, and different actual people that were in the buildings and what their experiences were. It talks about a lot of the heroic things that happened that day, the sad things that happened, and also some coincidences that happened that help people to get through that day. So we're led through the day kind of talking about the confusion and how surprised people were and how they were able to work together to help a lot of people get out of the buildings. It's a great look at a really important time in our recent past without being too graphic or disturbing, and that is America Under Attack.
Okay, onto a completely different kind of book. This is called Bailey. It's by Harry Bliss. I will say off the bat that this book does not have any kind of deep meaning. It might not be a timeless book, but it's a very appealing book, a great back-to-school read, especially for maybe first and second graders who are still getting into the swing of things, who still might be nervous when school is starting again. And also got a lot of user reviews on Amazon, more than any of these other books that I checked. There are already over 100 reviews, which is very unusual for a new picture book like this. So it's obviously gotten a lot of hype, and it kind of speaks to the appeal of the book, despite not really having too much of a point. It's a very popular book already. We've got this appealing little dog. He's going to school and doing all the things that you would do in a typical school day. He's not nervous about being himself because he just is himself. He's a dog. And it's kind of funny because we never see any of the students or the teachers think it's odd that this dog is at school. It's just a given that this dog is in school and is the only dog in school. But, you know, he's himself, even though he makes mistakes. He always has friends because he's an appealing, friendly little guy here, so that's a good message for everybody. But he does get into mishaps being a dog. He eats his homework and has to go to the school nurse. I like that the school nurse is a guy. You know, he tries to do math. He adds up some bones. He gets in a mishap in art class. And at the end of the day, he falls asleep and almost misses his bus. But these kids kind of fight over the chance to be with this dog. And I think that's because this dog tries hard and is comfortable with himself, and that's probably the message. Don't overthink things, have fun in school. So that is Bailey.
Our next book is Balloons Over Broadway, and it is about the start of the Macy's Day Parade, and more so it is about Tony Sarg. who is really responsible for making the parade what it is today. We find out that Tony came to the United States as a child. He loved marionettes and how things moved. He loved making things move, and he was really ingenious as a child. He talks about some inventions he made as a child. But he comes to the United States with his puppets, and while performing on Broadway, R.H. Macy sees him and his puppets and immediately hires him to make marionettes for his windows at Macy's. And he decides he's going to make marionettes of storybook characters and makes a really wonderful store window just from his own creativity. And soon after, R.H. Macy wants to have a parade for his employees. A lot of the employees at Macy's were from different countries and were immigrants to our country, and wanted to remember kind of festivals and street carnivals that they had in their own country, and kind of a way for them to all celebrate together. So he thought, wouldn't it be great to have a parade from Harlem to the Macy's store? And what's great in our illustrations here, we really have a synthesis of information as well as illustration. For this book, the illustrator made little toys that she photographed and put into the pictures. She also adds things. Now in this picture where they're talking about the first parade, on the side we actually have a map of New York City, and it's showing the parade route starting in Harlem, coming south, and then we see a great 2-page spread of one of the first parades. And they really wanted it to be a spectacular parade, so Tony, kind of thinking of a puppet he used to have that was on sticks, this one here, it's sort of a little caterpillar on 2 sticks that would crawl. He used this as an idea to then form some really large marionette type items where, rather than being a marionette from the top, he thought, what if you controlled it from the bottom using sticks, and they could look like they articulate or move like the actual item. And it was a real hit. People loved it. However, in the parade, they also borrowed some animals from the zoo to put in the parade. And unfortunately, all the people, and then having all the animals around, really riled the animals up, and the lions roared, and the bears roared, and it really kind of scared the children. So the next year he said, it needs to be even bigger and more spectacular. We're going to take the animals out, but we need something really big in place of the animals. So Tony Sarg, ever the inventor and so creative, comes up with the idea, again, from his old little caterpillar puppet. He thinks of, let's make these into balloons. We can control them from the bottom. And he even really, this is before we had this type of thing, he thought, let's make them really big. I can sew them out of type of parachute material, and to help partially fill them with helium, which is lighter than air, to help let them float. And he really had a lot to contend with. It had to be big enough for everyone to see, because also the parade had gotten so popular that people standing in the front could not see the parade. Unless you were in the front, you couldn't see the parade. So the parade had to go on above people so everyone could see it. So he had to get the parade above the crowd. It had to be durable enough to make it through weather in New York City in November. It also had to be durable enough to go under the L train when they got to that point on the parade route. So he had a lot to contend with, and ended up creating a really amazing parade that worked well, and it's really become the parade that we know today. And I like that with this we include in the back pages, there's some actual news clippings. This is one of the advertisements for the parade, and you can see what some of these really old helium balloons look like. They're a lot different than what we see today.
He's scary, I think.
Yeah, he's a little different, but this is some of the first ones, and it's really interesting to see these actual clippings. We also have, towards the beginning, this is a collection from a book that is actually talking about Tony Sarg himself, where they wrote about him, and we have these clippings. So we get a lot of actual artifacts as well as illustrations to kind of articulate different things in the books. And then we have these fun toys pictured as well. So it's a really interesting book. Every page has something that is going to catch your eye, something to look at, and it's also a really interesting story. And I have to say, I never really gave the Macy's Day Parade a second thought. It's something I took for granted and never really thought about where it came from and how much ingenuity and invention had to come about for that to take place. And Tony Sarg was a really amazing guy. So that is Balloons Over Broadway, the true story of a puppeteer of Macy's Parade. Our next book is Dragons and Monsters. This is in the Encyclopedia Mythologica series. It's a really great pop-up book and a great introduction to different mythical creatures. The pop-ups are absolutely amazing, completely eye-catching. You're going to get any group's attention with this. Here we have Medusa, and then what's amazing is we get some good information. It's brief, but it's useful. And then we open up these fold-outs for more information and more pop-ups. So we have a lot of pop-ups, a lot of motion, a lot of movement. So as you're reading, you're going to be looking on the page wondering, okay, where's the next place I go? What happens when I open this? And then these pop-ups, if you're reading to a group, that's going to catch a group's attention as well. Now, this is not one I would just give to kids to handle on their own unless they are responsible enough. I wouldn't give it to little kids because of all the moving parts and how delicate the pop-ups are. But you really just can't compete with how amazing they are. It's a great introduction. I don't know how much of a actual citing resource this could be because we kind of just get a brief overview of different animals. Here we have dragons. But you get a lot of great information to maybe get kids interested that they could pick one of these to then report on. And here we have dragons talking about, we just had a dragon that's more European. Now we have an Eastern dragon. So we're getting into also different cultures around the world that incorporate these mythological creatures in the history of their storytelling. We have the kraken. We have vampires, and I love if you watch, he's lifting up his own coffin when he's opening that. And then when we do this, this one is great as well. We see the guy here howling at the moon, and we know he's going to turn into a werewolf. So we see his head dipping down and turning into the head of a wolf as we open this. And then there is also the Yeti. So it's great, we get a little background information on different cultures that incorporate and have these mythical creatures in their history and storytelling, as well as a really interesting, visually interesting book to look at. And that's Dragons and Monsters. Next is Heart and Soul, The True Story of America and African Americans by Kadir Nelson. This book talks about some of the U.S.'s most proud and most shameful moments in its history, focusing on the story of African Americans in the United States. The illustrations are excellent. The expressions on the faces and the detail, they're really just gorgeous illustrations throughout the book. It's a very long book, so it's not one that you could really read aloud in one sitting, but there's a lot of great information. We find out the story is being told by sort of a grandmother figure who her grandfather had come to Africa as a slave. And she talks about too, it's an unflinching look. She talks about there's good and there's bad, and I'm kind of going to tell you like it is. And she does. She tells it like it is. She talks about her grandfather was a little boy in Africa and was chased, kidnapped, put on a boat, and sold into slavery when he arrived in our country. And talks about that her grandfather told her how difficult it was on the boat and also how difficult life was as a slave. And we go through then her family's journey. Her grandfather worked very hard on the plantation, and then the Civil War started, and people needed to, the Union Army needed help, and he thought about running away, and he did. He ran and joined the Union Army and worked harder than he did, he thought, and was not fed as well as when he was on the plantation, but he felt he was working for something that was really important, and he was proud of what he did, and then he was happy that he was able to go back to that same plantation and let them know that everyone had been set free after the war was done. And he then worked as a sharecropper, and we find out that while he's now free, his life is not much easier. He's working just as hard, and it turns out working as a sharecropper, there's a really great description in here of sharecropping that basically says he would work, split the cost with the owner of the land, and then at the end of the year when the money came in, the amount from the profits would be deducted for the cost of the seed, his living expenses living on the farm, and all of that. And so then it turns out that when the landowner would kind of do his own creative math, it turned out it would end up that her grandfather would end up owing the landowner money, and he wasn't making any money working hard raising all of these crops for the landowner. And was kind of being cheated. So then they went along to the Great Migration up north. They ended up in Chicago, and her family was able to get jobs in factories. But they find as well that there are only certain jobs available to them, and they can only live in certain parts of town. And they talk about how there was a celebration as they crossed the Mason-Dixon line, but she says Jim Crow came right along with them, and things were not... there were still some injustices going on in the North. And then we get into civil rights. And she talks about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and some really moving pictures. This one in particular, she talks about a march that a lot of kids skip school to march, mostly high school students, but some even as young as 6, she says, and how they turned the hoses on the children while they were marching. And I think that's a view a lot of people have seen in footage, and we have this moving picture here of the children and the water. And then she gets into the March on Washington and Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And then we end with an epilogue where she talks about today. She looks back and thinks about her ancestors, and then also today how she and her children and grandchildren have lived to see Barack Obama elected to the White House, and how moving and important that is for her. So we get a really interesting personal look at the history of the United States, and I think a really straightforward, honest telling. And this is a great book to use with older grade school and even older kids. I mean, this I think would be great even through high school, and even adults would enjoy this book. The illustrations are wonderful, the writing is straightforward, and that is Heart and Soul, The Story of America and African Americans by Kadir Nelson.
Okay, now we have If You Lived Here, Houses of the World, and it's got some great layered cut paper illustrations. If you go on Amazon, which is where I went to look at some of the reviews of this, it actually shows the process that the author and artist used to create these illustrations, which are actually very dimensional looking. If you're familiar with Jeannie Baker, she's the only other illustrator I know of who has popular books in this style, so it's not something you see a lot of. And like the title says, this goes through different types of home dwellings all over the world. Here is a chalet. Then you've got Pueblo homes, which you have to climb a ladder to get up to the higher levels. And each text box has a basic summary. Then it tells you the type of materials used, the locations, the dates that these homes existed or were most popular. And then it gives you an interesting fact about each home. Here we've got, from the United States, a house attached to a barn. which was common in the northeastern United States and reached the peak of popularity decades after the Civil War. I thought this one was very interesting because I had no idea. I actually learned something from pretty much every different spread in this book. This is a cave dwelling, and it says that today there are 45 million troglodytes living on our planet, and that it means cave dweller. So even though we've lived in caves since prehistoric times, there are still many people. In Spain's Sierra Nevada mountains, 12,000 people live in caves. So that's interesting. And it talks about why various features exist on these homes, how they're adaptive to their environment, the benefits of living in this particular type of home. So you really see a lot of homes you might not even have heard of, from the grand to the more basic. Here we have a home, a modern home in the Netherlands that's actually a floating home, which rotates with a steering wheel. It has solar panels, and it's an example of a very green design. So this is kind of a very modern home that is very ecologically motivated in its architecture. And we have finally a tree house, which is very interesting. Then we have a map, and it's numbered where each of the basic types of houses are. So this is definitely very educational. Here's a gorgeous shot of a home that is in the water in Venice, it looks like, and they're arriving by gondola. So that's if you lived here, Houses of the World. Definitely this would be great for a geography unit, maybe even if you're talking about Earth Day, about similarities between people. It's very interesting. Okay, this next one is called Ink Blot. Drip, splat, and squish your way to creativity. Now, I didn't know there was that much to say about ink blots because this is actually a pretty in-depth book, and it's shelved in our young adult section at our library, but this is actually something you could use in upper elementary school quite easily, especially if you're not reading the entire text but are just incorporating some of the ideas into your art or English class, because there are a lot of art starters and story starters in this book. So if you like those kind of activities to get children creative, then this book really has a lot of great examples you can use. Talks about ink blots themselves, different techniques for making ink blots, and different kinds of projects you can do with them. How they're great for encouraging creativity, combining art and storytelling. And she actually has a gallery here, an online gallery, of people who have sent in their own inkblot illustrations, and a lot of those children are actually quite young, like 6 or 7. And the results are really interesting. And I believe this gallery is still online, and she gives a web address to visit this gallery, so you could use that along with your unit. This is just a great book with lots of examples and lots of techniques in it. And going along with that, although I talked about it actually when I was talking about our pre-K books, this is Beautiful Oops. It's by Barney Salzberg, and it's actually about using mistakes to base your art off of, or to inspire different kinds of art. Here's a spill that becomes an elephant illustration. There's different things. A coffee cup stain becomes a mud puddle for this illustration of a frog. Holes in your paper can become different things. And this is really about creativity and resilience from mistakes, but this would be a great book to use together with the other book to talk about those kind of themes. So this is a really good accompaniment to the ink blot book that you might want to consider using with it.
Our next book is Just a Second, A Different Way to Look at Time. And this book really does take looking at time to the next level. You know, there are a lot of books that talk about, for younger kids, how long is a second, how long is a minute, how long is an hour, and talks about different things that maybe you do in everyday life in that amount of time. Well, this book talks about that as well, but things that happen every day in nature, but things that you may not know are happening, or you may not know how much is happening. Now, in 1 second, and then we get First of all, a little blurb about where the second came from. The second doesn't relate to any cycle in nature. It's a human invention and the shortest interval of time most of us use in our daily lives. So we get a little history on the unit of time that we're discussing, and then we find out different things that happen in nature, usually with animals, in 1 second. Things like a bumblebee beats its wings 200 times. So if you're using this with the group, we know how long a second is. We can even demonstrate a second when we start reading this book. But then to think in that short amount of time, 200 times this bee is beating its wings. Or a midge, a kind of gnat, beats its wings 1,000 times. A lot of these, I just thought, how is this happening? So we have a few pages on a second. And then we get into 1 minute. And we find out, we get then a little information about the minute, and then different things that are happening in a minute. And also pertaining to humans, a person standing in one spot at the equator travels 18 miles as the earth rotates in 1 minute. A person walking at a brisk pace covers about 300 feet in 1 minute. And we also have different natural things that happen in the world as well. So it's really a different way to look at this. After a minute, we get into an hour. We get into 1 day. And that's when a May larva hatches, lives its entire life, and dies in 1 day, which that too really caught my eye. We then too, the world's population increases by about 215,000 people. And then it gives stats on how many are born and how many die in a day. And then we get into things that happen in a week and also in 1 month. So this really opened my eyes. Oh, and 1 year. It really opened my eyes to different things going on, particularly in the natural world. A lot of things I didn't know about. And then very quick, we get some more facts as well about different things and things that happen at different lengths of time, and very long, things that take a really long time, as well as a quick time. So there's a lot of great information. This would be great with older kids to just be looking at time in a different way, and also to kind of get your mind turning and juices flowing, thinking about different things that are going on all around us that maybe we take for granted or don't even notice. And could be a great starter, maybe for a research unit where one of these facts might then spur something that your students want to research more and learn more. So a lot of information, really interesting, and that is Just a Second, A Different Way to Look at Time by Steve Jenkins.
Okay. Here is a book called Lemonade and Other Poems Squeezed from a Single Word. This book deals with a new form of poetry. As far as I know, there hasn't been a children's book that uses this form of poetry, which is based on using the letters found in a single word. And you can use those letters as many times as you need to, but you can't use any letters that are not in the title word. So what we have is actually a concrete poem here, which is kind of difficult to read. You have to get used to reading in an unconventional way. And then the page of the concrete poem has a little bit of an illustration in it. Nothing too major or interesting, but it just illustrates the concept. And then the opposite page, or the opposing page, has a straightforward reading of that same poem. So, lemonade is made 1 ad, added 1 lemon, load, and 1 mom. And we have a lot of poems based on daily or routine things that we might do at home or school. Some of them are a little more philosophical and elegant. Some of them are a little bit humorous. This one's Constellation. A silent lion tells an ancient tale. And here we have the illustrated version with the flowing text. So this would be a great activity to use in an English class, to give children a word and have them make a poem using only these letters. It's a great start to a poetry unit. It perhaps has some more guy appeal than other poetry books because it's a very minimalist form of poetry. And if you used Mirror Mirror from last year's list, that was also an invented recently form of poetry. I think it was called Reverso. and it was the same poem with the lines reversed, giving it a totally different meaning, but the theme was all fairy tales. And so it's interesting how there's still new formats or forms of poetry being created, and how children can use them. So it's an ever-evolving thing. So that's Lemonade. Then we have Louise the Big Cheese and the Back to School Smarty Pants. This book's a pretty straightforward book. It definitely takes its inspiration perhaps from the appeal of the Fancy Nancy type books. You can see that the letters are actually embedded glitter. And that might turn you off from using this book in a classroom because it does have that kind of a girly feeling to it. But it's not a very materialistic book. It doesn't focus on possessions or shopping or being stereotypically girly, even though it might give that impression initially. I think that's just kind of the result of maybe pandering or wanting to jump in with that audience. But the actual book is very interesting, and it's about grade inflation, which is something you don't see a lot of picture books about, but is something that a lot of people are talking about really earning your grade. So if you're a teacher that might be a little more strict or might want your kids to earn their grade, this might be a good warning at the beginning of the school year to take out this book and see if they take the hint that you might not just be giving out A's just for the sake of it. And it focuses on this little girl here who is named Louise, and she wants to get the teacher who only gives A's and is really easy, but instead she gets the tough teacher. And she sometimes gets C's in her class now, which she's never gotten in her entire life. And the teacher's kind of strict about listening in the classroom and raising your hand. So she doesn't like this teacher. She imagines her abducted by aliens. Then she gets a substitute teacher who gives everyone A's. Her name is Miss Sprinkles. She's kind of a flake. And she realizes, you know what? Even though I finally got an A, so did everyone. And I didn't really earn that A. I didn't really improve at anything. I want to earn an A by the end of this year. And she ends up getting all B's and 1 B plus at the end of the year. And her teacher's really proud of her, notices her improvement. And then there's a little quiz at the end. It says, I still want straight A's, do you? So it's kind of tips about how to succeed in school. So this is a good message about achievement, about earning things, and about pride in yourself, self-respect, having to do with performance at school. Louise the Big Cheese.
And our next book is Meadowlands, a wetlands survival story. And this is about the Meadowlands in New Jersey. Now, I know I don't live in New Jersey, I'm not from there, but I have heard that New Jersey's had quite a reputation as being dirty, smelly, having a lot of garbage, and for a while it was kind of a joke about New Jersey. And I never really knew the reason behind that, and this book is about the Meadowlands in New Jersey and how that came to be and what they've done to change that. So this is a great environmental story. We start out with the history of the area, and first we talk about modern day. From New York, you can see New Jersey, from New York City, and you can see the Meadowlands. And around the edge of the pages, we're seeing little drawings of different things in modern day that are in this area, like a warehouse, a mall, football fans, a rest stop. And we then go back in time to when the Lenape tribe lived there, and we have different drawings of things around the edge of the paper that were used when they were living in the Meadowlands. And then we get the European settlers, and that's really when things started to go wrong. The Meadowlands started to be drained. The whole environmental makeup of the area was being adjusted and changed, and it was really hurting the area. It wasn't thriving. And then when we get to in recent history, it became polluted, and it became really just a dumping ground. A lot of buildup happened around. There was a lot of population and buildings around the Meadowlands, and it became a dumping ground for chemicals, for garbage and waste. And it just became an embarrassment and a joke. It was smelly and dirty and disgusting and a wasteland. And we're seeing that a lot of these things around this picture where we see the garbage dump, we're seeing a lot of things that also were dumped into this area that were really toxic and full of pollution. Well, then people decided, this is really not a good thing. It doesn't look good and it's not good for our environment, so we need to change it. And now from this point on, we talk about how the government and a lot of local activists worked together over several years to help turn this around. They decided we need to stop dumping and start cleaning, and also start letting the environment naturally heal itself and let the Meadowlands do what they need to do. So they really took back this land, they cleaned it up, and let the environment, now these are just different native plants in the area that were able to grow once again. And it took a long time, but once those got growing, then local animals, bugs, birds, and animals were able to come back into this area as well. And over a lot of time and a lot of hard work, it now has become a nature preserve. A lot of these animals have been able to come back, and now schools and people can come and enjoy the Meadowlands as a natural habitat. And it does say too, it still has a ways to go. It's definitely started, these animals are coming back, and it's only going to thrive more and more and become more natural and more of a wonderful place to visit as we let it thrive. So I really like that we get the history of the area, we get the natural viewpoint, we also get the political viewpoint of activists and government working together to help clean this area, and then we also have the great environmental message as well. So it's not only a good story just to share with your class, but also too if there's some sort of action your class might want to take. Maybe not the Meadowlands, but maybe there's something around your school or in your neighborhood that they might want to write to their local politician about, or organize something to help clean up an area, or raise money for something, or really take action. This is a good book to kind of spur that as well. There's a lot of great points made in Meadowlands, a wetland survival story. And next is A Nation's Hope, the story of boxing legend Joe Louis. I had heard about this boxing match between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling. I think a lot of people have heard it mentioned, but it wasn't until reading this book that I really understood the historical importance of the match and really how many people were invested in this match. I knew it was a big match, but it definitely went beyond boxing. And this match is between Joe Louis, and here we have Max Schmeling. This again is also illustrated by Kadir Nelson. We have excellent illustrations. We get a lot of sense of the feel, the emotion in the different pictures. And we hear that Joe Louis, who was a boxer, and then we look back on his childhood. He seemed to have a tough childhood. He didn't seem to fit in. He didn't speak until he was 6, and even then he had a stammer. He really didn't have a place or feel comfortable or feel like he had come into his own until he was a young man, a teenager, and ended up in a boxing gym. And that really is where he found his talent and felt that he fit in. He trained and ended up with a lot of work becoming a really good boxer. And this is also during a time where there was a lot of segregation, and being a black boxer and a black gentleman in the United States at the time was not easy for him. But he worked hard, he was an excellent boxer, and he ended up having some really high profile matches. And he fought Max Schmeling the first time, and Max won. And Joe was not discouraged. He kept working. But now, of course, this match we have white German Max Schmeling, who defeated black American Joe Louis. And they want Joe Louis wants a rematch. And this then, too, we see from this book that because Joe became such a high-profile boxer, he was a hope for a lot of African Americans at that time. And a lot of people were really interested. When the rematch came, people were around their radios. There were millions of people that listened to the match over the radio because the match went beyond just a boxing match. It was something for the pride of the African American community, but it also spread then to the entire country. It then became the embodiment of America versus Germany on the eve of World War II. This really had high stakes, and a lot was placed on both of these men in their boxing match, and talks about how much work Joe Louis put into it and how much weight was on this match, and eventually Joe Louis in one round is able to defeat Max Schmeling. And he becomes a real hero, and we see him victorious at the end. So it really tells about a time in American history focusing around this boxing match, but really the boxing match is just the catalyst to also tell us about where America was at that time in history and what the real meaning beyond boxing was of these two men meeting up. And it spurred me to get a little more information as well, finding that Max Schmeling and Joe Louis stayed friends after this and kept in touch even as they were older gentlemen. And were both really amazing men as well as fighters. It's a great story to talk about race relations in the United States, our history, as well as what was going on leading up to World War II, and then this would be a great introduction going into a studying unit of World War II. And that's A Nation's Hope, the story of boxing legend Joe Louis.
This is called Arni, My Father's Village, and I really wanted to emphasize the quality and appeal of this book because it's the kind of book I don't think that children are going to check out themselves. Just based on the fact it's about a specific place they might not have heard of. They might say, well, that's this person's grandfather's story, but maybe that doesn't have any personal interest to me. I myself don't think I would have picked this up necessarily to look over it if it hadn't had so many good reviews. So this might be a book that could really shine in a classroom setting because it really would be a shame if it was overlooked. It's got gorgeous illustrations. It's written by and illustrated by Claire Nivola, and it is about this Sardinian island village of Arni, where she would visit when she was younger. And it's a kind of a nostalgic story. It's about a way of life, of course. You could do it as part of a genealogy unit, perhaps. But just to use it for an example of descriptive writing. The writing in this story is very descriptive. It deals a lot with the five senses, a lot with her various associations with things on the island, with her childhood. Here's just the first page. It says, in a sea of breathtaking blue where dolphins leaped and plunged in play lay an island. Tucked here and there along the white pebbled shores were grottos hung with stalactites. Above on the rugged cliffs, tiny goats picked their way among the rocks and thistles and wild-scented thyme. The fruit out of the island tasted like the fruit of paradise, but wild boars roamed the mountains. There were nettles that stung, scorpions with poisonous tails, and bandits who stole sheep and sometimes kidnapped people. In the very heart of this island in a valley lay the village of Arni where my father was born. And it talks a lot about the landscape, about the way of life, about how she grew up in this place and then eventually moved to a place that was almost its polar opposite, which would be New York City, but how she came back to Arni as an adult and found that a lot of it had been modernized. Neighbors didn't know each other anymore, but that there were still some qualities that remained the same, and how she felt, even though it was an island that many people wouldn't know about, how it was the center of life for her for many years. So this would, like I said, be great just for an example of some beautiful writing. So I hope you use it in your classroom or encourage someone to check this out because it would be a shame if it was overlooked.
Next is Poindexter Makes a Friend. And this book has our friend Poindexter, who is extremely shy. Poindexter has trouble talking to anyone and making friends because he is just so painfully shy. This is one of my favorites. This is showing Poindexter at one of his family's parties, and Poindexter is crawling under the rug, completely hidden, as people are trying to ask him, "How are you doing, Poindexter?" He is just so shy. And even the neighborhood kids ask him to play, and he's too shy to play with them, so he makes excuses. But the one place that he really feels comfortable is when he's reading, and he loves stuffed animals. So he loves reading to his stuffed animals, and he loves going to the library, which Jessica and I particularly like about this book. So in the library, he really is confident. He's able to help the librarian, and he's able to spend time with doing one of his favorite things, which is reading. Until one day, someone who's even more shy, a turtle, comes in named Shelley and needs help finding a book. And the librarian, who I think is pretty wise, thinks Poindexter might be a really good helper for this new friend who is really shy. So they go to the stacks together, and Poindexter helps Shelley find a book. And the one they pick is How to Be a Good Friend, or in How to Make Friends. And they go through the different steps. The first step is to smile. The second step, to give your name. They give each other's names. And the third step is to share. And sharing is giving away something to someone else to make them happy. The best kind of sharing is giving something you secretly wish you could keep. Good sharing is not giving up things you do not want, like old food or an ugly shirt. So the last thing they have to do is share. And then right at that moment, a mole shows up who needs help finding a book. And Shelley, following step 3, says, why don't you read our book on making friends? And so he's given up a book he really has enjoyed reading and wants to read himself, and gives it to the mole. But it turns out the mole has really poor eyesight, ends up reading the book upside down. So he brings it back to the boys and says, could you help me find what I'm really looking for, which is how to read in a dark tunnel. So the mole gets the perfect book for him. Poindexter and Shelley finish reading How to Make a Friend, and in the process they find out they have made friends with each other. And they make a plan then. They find out they both love stuffed animals, and one of Poindexter's favorite books that he's read 100 times is How to Play with Stuffed Animals. And they make an appointment to meet the next day and read How to Play with Stuffed Animals and bring all their stuffed animals with them. So it's a really sweet book. I like how it talks about how important it is to use the library and a joy of reading, but also how to be a good friend, and also how to help someone who maybe is really shy. I bet a lot of classes out there have some students that are really shy, and this is a good book to show that a lot of people are shy, shyness is okay, and maybe how to help with that shyness. And that's Poindexter Makes a Friend.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead because I want a chance to do one or two nonfiction books that might be great for your classroom. This is Saving Audie, a pit bull puppy gets a second chance. This would be great for a social studies class because this deals with a recent current event, which was Michael Vick's dog fighting scandal, which ended with a lot of these dogs, 49 different dogs, being rescued and quarantined in an animal shelter for over a month before they were tested to see what their behavior would be like around people if they were safe to go into a home situation as a pet. And turns out, despite the abuse they went through, that 48 out of these 49 pit bulls were deemed to be suitable family pets. The main focus is on this little guy here who did not have a name. He was called Number 86. And then he was taken to a foster home where he learned to interact with people as a regular puppy. Didn't know how to play. Here he is again, so sweet. So his face kind of speaks for himself. The illustrations are just photos of this little guy mostly. And it's kind of about how these different organizations, how a lot of people work together to right a wrong. It doesn't really focus on Michael Vick himself. It's not really a political story, but it is kind of a community story about these different rescue organizations and different types of people that were involved in rehabilitating these dogs. After he went to a foster family, this woman, Linda, wanted to teach him agility work, but he had bad knees. He had like a genetic problem with his knees, and so there was money in a fund put aside for these former fighting dogs to give him surgery. So he had to go through surgery after everything else he went through as well, and Here she is carrying him down the stairs in a little purse because his hips aren't ready to take the stairs. And here he is riding a skateboard. So they try all kinds of physical therapy. And then it's time to socialize him with other people. At first he's scared of some people, but here he is meeting people around the community, learning to trust people again. He takes a Canine Good Citizen exam or class and passes. Then he's able to do the agility competitions. And eventually he becomes so well socialized that he is used to become a companion to other dogs who are maybe afraid of people or other dogs. They take cues from little Audie here, who teaches them how to be well socialized. So here you can see he's interacting with other dogs, including a lot of his fellow pit bull friends who were rescued alongside him and were now adopted. So here he's meeting his friends. He becomes a therapy animal. Here he's helping a specific German Shepherd in his neighborhood who is afraid of other dogs by very gently introducing himself to this dog as a canine coach, they call it. And here's this final picture of him, happy as can be. So it's really also about the resilience of animals and their good nature. Then they talk a little bit about pit bulls and a little bit an organization called Bad Rap, which was founded to help pit bulls by fostering and launching a publicity campaign about the misinformation about pit bulls. And there's a timeline of the whole Michael Vick trial and the rescue of the dogs. And there are a lot of sites about raising pets, agility dogs, about pit bulls, and rescue groups for further reading online. Here you see Audie on his couch. And the back shot, I don't quite remember why he wore little pants, but it had something to do with
he had
the surgery.
and he would lick his
The
stitches.
wounds.
So he had to wear little pants so he didn't.
So not only was he
his...
toted around in a purse, but he wore tiny pants. And you can see that he was totally fine with that. He's a very sweet soul. So definitely try to incorporate this book into your classroom. It has a lot of kid appeal for sure.
Well, I'm going to jump ahead as well. I want to highlight Worst of Friends, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and the True Story of an American Feud. This is a really interesting story. I know it has been covered a lot recently, especially the popular series on John Adams. But it is really interesting, and I love it's told in a really fun and comical way for kids. And this is great to kind of introduce American history at the birth of our country and also introduce John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Talks about can presidents be pals? And I like this kind of really sets the tone. Not often. Now, it's true that Andrew Jackson thought President Martin Van Buren was absolutely tops, and George H.W. Bush called Bill Clinton a real friend. But lots of presidents didn't think very much of each other. After all, President Truman called Richard Nixon a shifty-eyed liar. And Theodore Roosevelt said President McKinley had the backbone of a chocolate eclair. So it's very fun. It talks about how John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were good friends, and they worked together at the very beginning of our country, the Declaration of Independence, and starting the to work on the foundation of the government that the United States would have. And they were good friends who took care of each other. They agreed very much, and they even went, after signing the Declaration of Independence, they ended up going to Europe together, talking to King George and also getting money for the United States. King George even was extremely, had a really big snub by turning his back on them. John Adams was the more fiery one. Thomas Jefferson was the more cool-headed. They really balanced each other that way, showing what a great friendship and what a great team they were. But then, when they got back to the United States and it came to figuring out the actual role of the president, they severely disagreed. Where John felt that the president should be the strongest person in the government, Jefferson worried that he would be more like a king. And so they have a falling out, and they say things they really shouldn't have or didn't mean, and it really ruins their friendship. And then as they go on and both are elected to president, John Adams even sneaks out in the dark so as to not have to see Jefferson. And their friendship is really lost until in their older years they end up writing to each other and renewing that friendship. And they really become great friends again and kind of catching up over years, over letters. And they end up both, this is amazing, dying on the same day, which is July 4th, our nation's birthday, in 1826. And they actually died within hours of each other on that same day. So a really great story about American history, about friendship, and told in a really entertaining way. And that's Worst of Friends. Did you have one book you wanted to highlight quick?
I
Did
do.
I see you catching one really quick?
Swirl by Swirl, Spirals in Nature. It's got very poetic language. It's almost like a picture book style with the woodcut illustrations when you're used to photography in a nature book. So it's got this very beautiful prose. And then you think, well, maybe I can't use this for my science class. My students are a little bit older. I want them to have more scientific information. Although this is a beautiful book, you get to the back and it talks about all the things that a spiral is. A snuggling shape, a growing shape, strong shape, reaches out, is clever, is beautiful, moves, and spirals are fascinating. So it talks about each of those facets of a spiral. Found in octopi, spider's web, ferns, ocean waves, tornadoes, and galaxies, and even in the core of our being, which is our DNA spirals or helixes. So it's very fascinating. I never thought so much about spirals and these adaptive things in nature, but I would definitely use this book with your science class.
Great, well thanks for joining us. This was Best of the Best 2012 Picture Books for K through 5. You can find our list on our website, www.browncountylibrary.org, and you can also place holds on these books through our website as well, through our catalog. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, not what you thought it would be someday. Trying to cope with the things you know while your confidence wants to explode. Try to write, you can't find the